Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Auditor General, for being here to testify today, and thank you to the department and the SEIU employees who are joining us as well for this important hearing. I just want to try to unwind from an accounting perspective, and you might be the best person to ask, about the cash flow that goes on with some of this SIF funding. And so, I think we're really looking, in my opinion, there are two different things that are going on here. You have the money that was spent on modernization that unfortunately didn't achieve its goal, $178 million set aside in Act 34 from 2013 to 2016, supposed to go towards modernization, did not achieve that goal. There was also funding for the operation of the call centers. And so in my head, those are two different things. They're obviously tied and linked together, but two different distinct things that are going on there. Modernization, and as we have been, you could continue, it's obviously not the preference, but you could continue to run those operations with the call centers and the funding for those operations going in whatever state it is, but at least it's operational and people are getting their calls answered and questions are being handled and claims are going filled. So on the call centers, the unfortunate decision was made to close 3 of those call centers and furlough a number of employees. When you look at the revenues that are coming in and the expenditures here, can you talk about the cash flow and how those revenues come in? And so, for instance, in 2017, when there were furloughs that were conducted and people were ultimately off the job, revenues were coming in, but some of these expenditures, the UC deputate, Office of Chief Counsel, workforce development, those things, could they have been delayed so that the operations of the call center continued?
This is an inter-administration decision of whether, if you're running low on money, do you pull money from one pot to try to pull it into another pot? That was not done. Our lack of having the segregated fund makes a lot of this challenging for us to make a formal decision. Our instinct is, along the lines, and I for a host of reasons, you get to phrase it differently, but our instinct is that a chunk of this money did go to personnel, but again, that's an instinct. We can't verify a lot of this through our auditing process. We did, one of the benefits I thought of the way we went about this audit was this was the first time that there was a full public airing of the process of how the furloughs and which call centers were closed was publicized. My preference would have been that would have happened, should have happened at the beginning, so at least whether you agree or disagree, we could have all been working from the same standard. The one that I had the most question about was the one in Altoona because it was in a state office building, and just knowing from how we've done our leases in the Department of the Auditor General, you get pretty good lease deals when you're in a state building. But they did have a system and a process that they used. But I come back to the beginning point. The lack of a segregated fund makes it hard for me to say, this is what happened. Judgment-wise, there is a judgment that any administration could make is, do I pull money from pot A because I'm low on pot B and then I'll figure out a way to pay that pot back later? Or say, look, I'm not playing games with this. We got to find a way to get the legislature and us to work together on it. That's a policy decision that the administration made, and now everyone's sort of dealing with the circumstances moving forward. But I do think the part that our audit that was probably the most revealing was the actual process used to close the centers, because that was not publicized before, and so at least there was some standard that was used. Again, you can agree or disagree, but at least and the one that I've raised the most concern about was the one in Altoona.
Okay, and so from a policy perspective, the Act 34 dollars it was supposed to be temporary funding.
Correct. That's correct. Yes.
And so that was temporary funding that was allocated out of the collections for modernization of the system and also continued operations during that time period. And so without that temporary funding, what's the source of revenue for the call centers to continue their operations?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Were there other revenues that would have been available to continue these operations if the SIF funding was no longer available, even just in a short-term period?
This is not part of the audit, but my instinct would be yes.
Okay. And so, I mean, that gets to my point. Again, I was very concerned. Were there any revenues or funding that was held back for modernization in this year, in 2017, that you're aware of?
I'm not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
But again, I want to come back to this is the problem of not having the segregated fund.
Okay. And my concern is, I agree with you on the need for a segregated fund. I just feel that there were different funding sources available, certainly within the Department of Labor and Industries UC account, and also greater state government that could have possibly continued these operations. And I don't think those avenues were fully explored when we ultimately ended up furloughing these employees and closing call centers.
Whether they were or weren't fully explored, I can't answer, but I do know that there was no legal barrier that I'm aware of to taking some other pot of money to put in there. Maybe that's the best way to answer your question.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General, and thank you, Chairman.